Hi, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Okay. It is 1 o'clock on the dot. We are so excited to have you with us, Bill Fletcher Jr. Sarah, have you been able to give Bill co-hosting capabilities so he can share his screen? If necessary.
Yes, I was able to make him a host.
Great. Okay.
I won't need to be sharing it.
Oh, good. Okay.
Thank you.
Just in case you needed to do that.
Yeah, I was thinking about it, but
okay.
I'm going to pass it by.
All right. Well, thanks so much for being with us. It's such an exciting honor to have you here. It's right at 1 o'clock, so I think we should just kick it right over to you, Bill. And thank you so much for being here with us for your class on why race and class still matter. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. Well, good afternoon. And I am honored to have been invited to speak with you today. What my plan is to outline history. And then, but to open this up to a discussion. And depending on time, in some ways it'd be great if we could do certain things, small groups. I don't know whether that would be feasible. But I'm going to guarantee you that there'll be plenty of time for questions, comments, debate, however you'd like to do it. And as far as I'm concerned, there's nothing that's off, nothing that cannot be discussed. It's all on the plate. So the topic is, why do race and class still matter? And in some ways, probably the answer should be apparent, but I'm gonna start with something that struck me the other day. Because sometimes we think that everyone is operating on the same definitions. I read about a canvasser who was in Michigan contacting potential voters. And she was not just asking people to vote for her candidate, who I believe was Biden, but she wanted to know, what were people thinking? So she reached one person and she asked, what's the most important issue for you? And, in this election, and the person said, racism. And she said, okay. And the person then said, and because racism is my top issue, I'm voting for Donald Trump. Now, I had to read this a few times because I've been watching the news and listening very carefully to what Trump has been saying. And what's interesting and implicit in this is that we don't all share the same definition when we're talking about something like race and racism. That some people draw completely different conclusions. And I would argue that that is largely based on the absence of a historical framework. in order to put this all together. So in order to offer that, let me present a few things. First of all, when we talk about class, what are we talking about? So we're not talking primarily about income, even though in the United States, you know, there's this fixation on low income, middle income, upper income, because income doesn't really tell you a whole lot. You can have people that are actually very poor, but they're small business people. And they may be making less than someone who's a construction worker. So what is class? Class is more a relationship that one has to both work and power. And it lives in, it links the reality and lives of individuals in a way that income levels just simply can't. And the thing about class arises in the life of humanity when there was a social surplus to divide. And this was the critical thing. When there was a social surplus that was created through agriculture, et cetera, the question was, how was it going to get divided? Who would make that decision? Who would get what? And it's in that context that we start to see the rise of classes. So it's, and when we're talking about something like the working class, we're talking about people who, by and large, lack the opportunity or the ability, because of what they're doing, to simply go out and hang out a shingle and set up a business. This is a category then of class, of working class. But a class is barely aware of itself, or at least the working class is, unless it finds itself in struggle with others, with another class. Now, the rich, the ruling class in most societies, is very conscious of itself as a class and very conscious of its particular interests. It's usually the people at the bottom that are less conscious of that, or try to explain it away, or often go at war with one another. So this will be something that comes up later in this talk. In conclusion on this point, as long as there's a social surplus that is not divided equitably, there will be classes. All right, so then what then is race and what is it not? And this is where things get interesting. On the planet Earth, scientifically, there is only one race, that's Homo sapiens. And we originated in one place, which was in Africa, in Southern and Eastern Africa. We didn't originate all over the world and then somehow something new came into existence. Humanity, as we understand it, arose in Africa. So in that sense, there's only one race, and indeed, we're actually all Africans. Yet, when we talk about race in everyday discussion, we're talking about more of a political construction. It's a reality that we live with and live through. So then what is race when we're talking about it in everyday terms? One, race then is what I would call a material and ideological manifestation of a differential in treatment between populations imposed by a ruling force that dominates the state. Now that may sound cumbersome, so let me repeat it. Race is the material and ideological manifestation of a differential in treatment between populations imposed by a ruling force dominating the state. In other words, race is not something that's natural. It's not that, well, you know, humans simply can't get along. It's something that is actually created where there's a differential in treatment between populations. And that differential in treatment can be any number of things, which we'll get to in this presentation. But in the current era, it can be anything in terms of who gets what jobs, who is able to get what loans from banks, who can live in certain places, who cannot, one's relationship to law enforcement, a series of things. All right, well, if race then was constructed, when was it constructed? and this may come as a surprise. I often say that there were no white people on planet Earth before 1492. There were plenty of Europeans, but there weren't white people. So what happened in 1492? Why is that relevant? So in 1492, we all know Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But before Columbus sailed, he went to Isabel and Ferdinand, the Queen and King of Spain, and asked for support for this voyage. They said, we will give you the support, but you have to wait a second because there's something that we have to take care of first. And most of us growing up had no idea what that something was. What that something was, Isabel and Ferdinand wanted to drive out of Spain Jews and Moors. The Moors were the people from Northern Africa, mixture of Arabs and Berbers and other groups that had controlled most of Spain since the 700s. In fact, the Rock of Gibraltar is named after a Moorish general who led the expedition into what was then called Al-Andalus and took over Spain. And so for much of a 700-year period, most of Spain was controlled by Moors, or at least shared with Moors. The Isabel and Ferdinand made an effort to drive the Jews and the Moors out of Spain. They either had to convert or leave, or they died. The Inquisition would make sure of that. So and upon this completion of what came to be known as the Reconquista, the new ruling group in Spain began to talk about the purity of the blood and talking about race. They called it la raza, not la raza the way that Chicanos use the term in the 60s on, but la raza meaning this notion of a pure race. Now, at a scientific level, it's sort of absurd to think about any kind of pure races, but it's really absurd after 700 years of occupation by North Africans to talk about the Spanish as having pure blood. It's just simply inconceivable. But that's where the ideological came in, which was the promotion that Spain was one people. It was a white people, it was a Christian people, and it was to be distinguished from the Jews and from the Moors. So some of the earliest developments of race, which were of course built upon by, years of prejudices and biases among different kingdoms in Europe, but this construction of something new, this new sort of division of humanity arises in the context of 1492 and the Reconquista. And when the Spanish and the Portuguese go to and invade the Western Hemisphere, they bring these ideas and practices with them. The other contributing factor in the construction of race takes place to the north, when the English succeed in the 200-year effort to conquer Ireland. By the 1500s, the English subjugated Ireland. And when they did, they completely dispossessed the indigenous Irish. The indigenous Irish could no longer speak their own language. The English moved in settlers, poor people from England, Wales, and Scotland, and gave them the better land, pushing the indigenous Irish to a great extent south or onto worse land. The settlers were given relative advantages, a differential in treatment between their situation and the indigenous. So no matter how poor a settler would be, as long as they swore oath to the crown, they were seen as and treated as superior to the indigenous Irish. But the English didn't stop there. They formulated an entire ideological framework, which was grounded on the notion of the inferiority of the indigenous Irish. Now, they didn't mean simply we've conquered the Irish the way the English conquered the Scots. They meant what they were saying, that as far as they were concerned, the indigenous Irish were inferior to the English. And this leads over hundreds of years to the construction of something that's known in Ireland and Britain as, believe it or not, anti-Irish racism. because in the context of Ireland and Britain, but not the United States, when it comes to Irish, the Irish were treated as an inferior race. They were understood. The English created an entire construct around this that portrayed the indigenous Irish as lazy, as drunks, as only concerned about sex, about having poor families, everything that you can absolutely imagine. So race begins to be constructed in a context where there were no what we call people of color. It was this differential in treatment orchestrated by a ruling group. Now, what happens after the 1400s and 1500s? When Europe en masse begins invasion of the Western Hemisphere, this practice, the practice of race, is brought with them into the hemisphere. Now, I don't have a lot of time to go into what happens in Latin America, although it is very important. If we do, I'll return to that. But when the British come to what becomes known as the 13 colonies, what they do is really amazing. So contrary to these myths where we were told, oh, all these people came to escape religious persecution, not really. There were some people that came to escape religious persecution, but there were adventurers that came and people that wanted to become rich, and they needed people to do the work in order that they would become rich, not the poor people. So they brought forced labor from Europe and from Africa. And they brought most of that labor over as what was called indentured servants, meaning that these people were not folks that came voluntarily, but when they came after a 7-year period, they could become free, own land, etc., including Africans. Africans were brought over, were forced to come here, initially in the 1600s, as mainly indentured servants and some as slaves. As the 1600s wears on, there's a transformation in the status of the African from indentured servants to slaves until ultimately slaves for life in the life of their children. But why does that happen? And it happened for a very particular reason. When the English arrived here and began settling the 13 colonies, they had two different problems. One was a labor problem. The second was a problem with the people that were already here. The English wanted to remove the people that were already here, the indigenous. And so they did that through a variety of mechanisms, including extermination, as well as pushing people further west. But in order to do the work, they needed a workforce. And that workforce was the forced labor that I was referring to, people from Europe and from Africa. And what's interesting in the 1600s is that these laboring people began to revolt against the elite that was running the colonies. And so in the 1600s, you see all kinds of uprisings that take place, the most famous being Bacon's Rebellion in 1676. In that context, the English ruling elite realizes they've got to do something to divide up this laboring force, and they basically implement what they had implemented in Ireland. They implement a form of racial oppression where they divided up the populations and they created this category known as white. And they used the category known as white to distinguish certain Europeans from the indigenous and from the Africans. And the distinction wasn't simply in people's heads, it took the form of a change in conditions. So a so-called white could not be enslaved. They could be made an indentured servant, they could be imprisoned, but they could not be made a slave. A person with a drop of African blood became Black. And when you became Black, you could be enslaved, no matter how light-skinned you were, no matter who your father was. And I say father because Europeans were raping African women. And no matter who your father was, you could be enslaved. You could be very light, you could have blonde hair, but if someone could identify that you had a bit of African blood, you were declared to be Black and could be enslaved. Now, this raises an interesting question that I grappled with for years. If one drop of African blood made you Black, why didn't one drop of Native American blood make you Indian? I couldn't figure this out. And then I stumbled across it in a study, and it was very simple. Land. If one drop of Native American blood made you Indian, that meant there was going to be a lot of people that could have land claims. And the objective of the settler ruling group was to always narrow the number of people that could make land claims. So none of this, you can't make this up. I mean, and it has nothing to do with science. It has everything to do with oppression and social control. So race comes to the Americas in order to ensure that the oppression take place of the Indians and the Africans, and that the laboring classes are divided up and that they'll keep fighting one another. Now, I wanted to say something about what comes to be known as Latin America, very briefly. The Spanish and the Portuguese did not send a lot of settlers to the Americas, in part because capitalism was not as developed in Spain and Portugal as it was in Britain, and Britain had a surplus population. They sent adventurers, mercenaries, etc. And once they took over these Indian kingdoms, a few things happened. In the first 100 years after Europeans arrived in the Americas, 80% of the indigenous people died off. 80. That level of Holocaust is just unbelievable. And it was through a combination of illnesses, war, and slavery. So the Spanish and the Portuguese needed workers, and they went to Africa, and they brought over Africans. Well, the Africans and Indians and the Europeans started intermixing, and there weren't a whole lot of Europeans. And so one of the things that the ruling groups from Spain and Portugal did is that they started to divide people up based on shades of skin color, giving different levels of privilege depending on how light you were. Now, in North America, the English sent larger numbers of settlers. They weren't interested in intermixing with the Indians. They'd rape them, but they weren't really interested in any kind of intermixing. They were mainly interested in removing the Indians from the territory and bringing more settlers in. So race played itself out differently than it did in Latin America, not better or worse, just different. And that becomes very important, by the way, when we talk about immigrants from Latin America and their experiences with race, and why it's a surprise for many of them when they come here, and why it's a surprise for many of us when we're interacting with people from Latin America. So then what do we make of these colors and race? Well, white became a uniform for guards. And I'm using that term very loosely. It basically was that certain people, of European descent, were guaranteed they would not become slaves, but they were also not guaranteed that they'd become rich. There was a possibility of becoming rich. But in order for any of that to happen and for them to be accepted, they had to accept being white, meaning that they had to engage in ensuring that the slaves never escaped and that the Indians were annihilated or driven off their land. Black became a prisoner's uniform, as I said before, meaning that no matter how light-skinned you were or how dark, if you had any African blood, you were Black and you were a prisoner. Red becomes the uniform for the outcasts or the indigenous. There was no place for them in the settler colony that was developing in the 13 British colonies and what later becomes the United States of America. The United States in particular made somewhere between 300 and 400 treaties with the Native Americans between 1783 and about 1880 and broke all of them. There was no interest in coming to accommodation. The idea was to keep pushing the Indians further and further off. So race then becomes a mechanism for ensuring that the people at the top in this developing capitalist society are able to stay at the top, and that the people at the bottom are always at war with one another, believing that each of them is the other's enemy. And we've seen this time and again and again and again. Now, over time, racial categories evolved in some really fascinating ways. In 1848, the United States succeeded in seizing the northern half of Mexico in the war with Mexico. And it brought in Mexicans and Native Americans. Now, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which settled the war, declared that the Mexicans were white people, which is really interesting because they were declared to be white people because if they had been declared to be anything else, they either would have been made slaves or would have been put on reservations. But the reality of their lives was never that of the European immigrants that were arriving on East Coast. And the lands that the Mexicans had in what becomes the United States were frequently taken from them, and they were put into very segregated circumstances. Asians began to be encouraged to come here, particularly Chinese and later Japanese, in the 1850s, when gold is discovered in California, and there's this the seeking of labor. The Chinese were brought here. In many cases, they were forced to come. They were kidnapped and brought over as indentured servants. In other cases, they were fooled into believing that they were coming to some level of paradise. But once they arrived, they were put under abysmal conditions, and the origin of Chinatowns came from the segregated communities in which Chinese were forced to live, and where the only businesses that they were allowed to have were laundries and restaurants. In terms of work, they were restricted largely to working on the railroads and the mines and agriculture. The other thing that's fascinating about these racial categories is that not all people that we would today declare to be white were declared to be white before 1924. In fact, the Irish were not declared to be white. They became white by the late 1800s, well after the mass migration from the potato famine. Well, that seems to be running contrary to common sense, because we all know that Europeans are white people, right? But not so fast. If you look at the historical record, what you see is that the people in the 1790s who were declared to be white tended to be the English, the Welsh, the Scots, not the Irish, French, Nordics, and Germans. That the Spanish had sort of depended. Jews, no, and Eastern Europeans, by and large, no, and Southern Europeans, no. And so what were they? Well, this is where it gets even, it really becomes almost laughable. Many of these populations were declared to be other races, literally. Jews, East Europeans, Italians were declared to be other races. I gave a speech once, and this guy of Sicilian origin came up to me afterwards and told me that when his ancestors arrived from Sicily, they went through Ellis Island, and on the immigration form, where it said race, what was stamped was dark, D-A-R-K. And when he said that, I said, my God, that now helps to explain hostility between Italians and African Americans, because the Italians and Sicilians in particular were a suspect race as far as immigration was concerned. And so there had to be this effort to prove, no, we're not Black. We're not Indians. We should be treated as white people. And there's a way that one goes about that. So this racial twilight zone led to different populations of Europeans being known as, and this is a term, questionable whiteness. That was a term that was used, questionable whiteness. Another term, provisional whiteness, and the term I like is probationary whiteness. And the reason I like that term is that it really brings to mind what was being talked about. that the Europeans that migrated here had to prove that they were white. And how does one prove that? You proved you were white by either joining in the migration west to take the land from the indigenous, or to cooperate in various forms of white supremacist behavior, like slavery when slavery was going on, or like what comes to be known as Jim Crow, or in other cases to help in the expansion, the imperial expansion of the United States, such as in the genocidal war that took place against Filipinos from 1899 to 1910, in which about 2 million Filipinos were annihilated. So you had this. Now, in the aftermath of World War I, there were very right-wing forces amiss in the United States, particularly the Ku Klux Klan, which was reemerging. It had been destroyed in the 1870s, but it reemerges. And it was, it was obviously anti-Black, but it was also anti-Mexican. It was anti-Jewish, anti-Catholic. And they became very large, and they began to push an immigration movement that ultimately results in something called the Johnson, what is the last? Johnson-Law. It was an immigration reform in 1924. Now this becomes really important for everybody to keep in mind. Before 1924, well, let me tell you this in the form of a story. I was doing a diversity training a few years ago, and for a union. And so this white guy comes walking into the room late, strutting in like a peacock, and we're introducing ourselves, your name, where you're from, and he introduces himself and then says, and my ancestors came here legally. Now, what was amazing about this is that we had not asked anybody anything about their ancestors, let alone whether they came here legally or not. So I understood that this guy was going to be messing with me. Now, what's interesting about the statement about my ancestors came here legally, which relates to a lot of the anti-immigrant rhetoric that goes on now, is that before 1924, the criteria for migrating to the United States was three things. You could not be Chinese, you could not be insane, and you could not be infirm. I hope you heard that. You could not be Chinese, you could not be insane, you could not be infirm. And so this raises an interesting question. If you leave aside the anti-Chinese bias, and someone wants to say, my ancestors came here legally, well then, okay, let's use the same criteria. You're not insane, you're not infirm, all right? Does that settle the question? I doubt that it does. Well, what happened in 1924? The KKK and others were successful in pushing this immigration reform that established very strict racial criteria. And so different populations from Europe had to prove that they were white, and there were restrictions on the numbers, and that resulted in many people of European origin who had come here found themselves undocumented until World War II. In fact, there were these debates about different European populations. One were the Armenians. Were Armenians white? Now, this seems like a kind of strange thing because there's this term that's often used, Caucasian, which derives from the Caucasus Mountains, north of Turkey, and what used to be the Soviet Union. And that's where Armenia is. So one would think, if you're going to follow logic, right, that if you're Armenian, you're from the Caucasus Mountains, so you got to be a white person. Nope, there was a debate about this. So sometimes they were white, sometimes they weren't. Ultimately, it was decided they were white people, which showed you that all of these categories were basically, forgive the scientific expression, BS. They had nothing to do with science. It was completely political, amazingly so. Let me just digress for 1 second. In the late 19th century, there was a development of something called scientific racism, which is an oxymoron. And they basically came up with this idea that humanity was divided into 4 races. Caucasoid, Negroid, Mongoloid, and Austroid. There was no scientific foundation. The whole purpose of that was to justify colonialism and racism. That was it. You know, Caucasoid, well, I mean, if Caucasoid, if that meant that your origin was in the Caucasus Mountains, well, that eliminates a lot of people. I mean, it was simply absurd. Well, in 1924, immigration changes, making it very difficult for people to migrate. And that helps us understand, among other things, why when Jews tried to come here to escape Nazi Germany, in addition to the rampant anti-Semitism that existed, they weren't let in, right? They were blocked, and they were turned back, and in many cases, as a result, they were eliminated, annihilated. There's much more that could be said about this. This is some background. Now let's talk just briefly about what does this have to do with organized labor. Then I want to bring it up to the present. The labor movement, as we understand, the trade union movement, originates in the 1830s in a period that's been misnamed called Jacksonian democracy under Andrew Jackson, who was not particularly democratic with a small d and was responsible for the annihilation of a lot of Native Americans. But the union movement develops then, organizations that look to the union, and they were segregated to a great extent by gender. But they did not allow anyone that we would describe today of color to enter in. After the Civil War, this union movement starts to reconstruct itself, but it divides largely on racial lines. The first labor federation, the National Labor Union, refused to allow in Chinese and people of African descent. Over the years, the Knights of Labor allowed in people of African descent, but would not allow in Chinese. They would allow in people of Mexican origin. So you ended up having these divisions. What was at the root of these divisions were two things. One was the early labor movement saw itself as part of a white republic that was developing, and everyone else was an outsider. That's one factor. The second factor was competition, that workers are always competing against one another for limited resources because of the way a capitalist society operates. And there's fundamental to unionism, there's two routes you can go. One is exclusion and one is inclusion. So there were unions that basically took the position that by excluding masses of people, particularly on the basis of so-called race, they could improve the living standard for those people who are recognized. You saw this in the railroads and the building trades, for example. You had other unions that said, no, we've got to organize all workers within our industry who are potential competitors so that we don't get played off against one another. The United Mine Workers was an example of that. The Industrial Workers of the World was a federation that was an example of that, that organized all as a way of building power. So the labor movement from its inception has been torn about how to deal with competition within its ranks, and particularly the competition that the ruling group has been trying to instill. In fact, I'm reading this great book called The Production of Difference, Race and the Management of Labor in U.S. History by David Roediger and Elizabeth Esch, which I would highly recommend. And they're talking about this issue of racial management and the way, beginning in slavery, but then post-slavery, the ruling groups have actively used race, very broadly defined, in order to divide up workers. And before 1924, when they would talk about race, as I mentioned earlier, they included different European populations that they would classify in different ways. For example, the people from Hungary, which is the origin of the term hunky, right, was referring to people from Hungary. It was a derogatory term. The attitude towards Italians and Sicilians, as I mentioned before. So there was this way that they tried to play upon these different divisions in order to ensure that these various populations would not come together. That was the fundamental thing. Ensure that people will not come together, keep them divided, and always bring in a workforce that's perceived as vulnerable and is less likely to unionize. I mean, again, you can't make this stuff up. It really played itself out. And this is what we have been grappling with ever since. Now, in the interest of time, let me just shift to some things about the moment that we're in and why, again, race and class become so important. We have been witnessing since the late 1960s, early 1970s, the growth of a mass movement that is very right-wing. It comes by different names, but the name that is generally used is right-wing populism. Right-wing populism is a movement currently associated with Donald Trump, but he just happens to be an exponent of their views. But right-wing populism is a view that believes that there are the people versus an elite, but the people are usually defined ethnically, racially, and on the basis of religion. So it's not like all the people. So Bernie Sanders is a left-wing populist. When he's talking about the people, he's talking about everybody. But when you have people like Steve Bannon, he's not talking about everybody. Bill O'Reilly, not talking about everybody. They're talking about populations, subpopulations that they would identify as legitimate and everyone else is illegitimate. Right-wing populism is rooted in the notion that the United States was and should be a white republic and that everyone else is a guest, wanted or otherwise. It sees as its critical image the Confederate States of America in the 19th century and the 1950s in the 20th century. The 1950s being the era where men were men, women were girls, Black people knew their place, and the only thing Mexican was a taco, right? That's the view articulated through right-wing populism. That is the view that's held up as that's what we sort of want to return to. Fundamentally, whose country is this? Right-wing populism is thoroughly racist, sexist, xenophobic, authoritarian, and revanchist and irrationalist. And I want to just explain this revanchism notion. Revanchism is a term often associated in Europe, and it basically, or with Europe, it basically is about revenge, the politics of revenge, the politics of those who believe something was taken from them without any legitimacy, and we want to get it back. And so what the right-wing populist movement has been trying to suggest in the United States, in Europe, in South Africa, and in Australia is that white people are an endangered species. They talk about a term called white genocide or white replacement. And it's the idea that these brown barbarian masses, brown, yellow, and Black masses are going to somehow enter in and sweep away civilization and subjugate so-called white people. And this fear, which I would argue Trump has played to countless times, most recently in your own state, when he says to one of his audiences about the importance of jeans, and I don't mean the jeans that people are wearing, this fear that somehow the Black, brown, and yellow masses will subjugate you. And so this revanchism is, we're going to take it back. This is part of what motivated people like Timothy McVeigh, what motivated the Aryan Nation, and many other such groups. They believe that the future is in the past, the mythical past, and there are both religious and secular versions of right-wing populism. I would suggest to you, my friends, that we are in a race against the impact and spread of right-wing populism, because right-wing populism has infected various parts of white America. It has made its major strength, interestingly, is not among the white poor, but among white people that are either well-to-do or just below that, who believe that they are threatened with dispossession, that they will either be crushed by the super rich or by the poor, and in combination with that, that white people will be driven out of existence. So we have this movement that we're fighting against, and it is a movement that is also armed, so that we're not just talking about an expression of debate among different points of view. The right-wing populist movement has an armed wing, and they made that very clear in those armed protests against social distancing. Final thing is this. So the battle that we fight, and why this becomes so relevant, the battle that we fight, we're at a moment in history where we literally are fighting to save the planet. We're fighting against a massive environmental catastrophe, and we're fighting against a growing and deepening economic catastrophe. Those at the top understand that in order to save humanity, in order to save this planet, there will have to be a rethinking about what we produce, how we produce it, and who gets it. And that threatens those at the top, which is why those at the top were ecstatic in 2017 with Trump's tax bill that enriched them even further, but couldn't give a damn about people at the bottom. And right now are allowing people that have lost their jobs as a result of COVID to face losing their homes, losing their apartments, losing their income, losing their lives. Because at the end of the day, the concern is how to preserve the existence of those at among the super rich. That will only happen if those at the bottom continue to be at war with one another. You know, it's sort of like the whole notion of the crabs in the barrel. The extent to which we're each pulling each other down and allowing someone standing outside of the barrel to dictate this, we actually have no future. To the extent that we understand the way that race and class interrelate, and that the objective of race and racist oppression is to ensure that people at the bottom are divided and despise one another. To the extent that we understand that, we can then overcome that, and we actually have a chance to transform our society, not to mention transforming the planet. So I'm going to stop there and open this up to questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bill. Just for starters, could everybody turn on, since we're a medium-sized group, it shouldn't be too difficult for everybody to turn on their video, just so we can see everyone and wave hello. And we can kick it off with a few questions, if anybody has any, for Bill about his presentation.
Any questions? There's no such thing as a stupid question. Anything you're thinking or comments that you want to offer, if you disagree with me.
One comment
Bill.
I would like to
Oh, go
make.
ahead, Diane.
Thank you. One comment I would like to make is a brief history that you gave is, it was surprisingly rich and deep, and it really made me rethink this whole issue in regard to race and how the politics of human interaction has really formed that. It was not anything other than that. And it just, this whole thing that we're going through right now with Black Lives Matter and the Native American issue, it gives it a whole different perspective.
Mhm.
And brings it down to a continuity with history that I had not appreciated heretofore. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Bill. Rose Roach here.
Hi.
Welcome to
Thank you.
MNA. Good to have you.
Thank you.
So I know I've heard you speak a couple of different times before, and one of the things that I always found really interesting, and I thought it would be helpful if you could talk a little bit about, we hear so much these days about, illegal, quote unquote, immigration, right? Lots of talking points around that. And then people say, well, if they just come here legally, as
Right.
if that is just something that's no big deal, sign a piece of paper, bing, bang, boom, you're here legally. Could you talk a little bit about the difference in what's happened with immigration policy over the course of time? Because I've heard you certainly educate me on how when they showed up at Ellis Island in the 1800s or early 1900s, significantly different than anybody trying to enter this country in the last few, maybe even 30, 40 decades. But if you could put some context on that, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you. I'd love to. So immigration in the United States dates back to 1793. I believe that was the year of the Naturalization Act, the first Naturalization Act. And it defined people who would be eligible for citizenship as being free white people. It didn't define who was white. And it was later overturned, but that was sort of the operating mechanism. Now, the migrations that happened in the 19th century are interesting in a number of different ways, and sometimes the subject of great misunderstandings. People coming from Europe, particularly from Catholic Europe or Jews, were subject to great hostility when they arrived in the United States. Great hostility, and many kinds of forms of discrimination were faced. After one generation, this starts to evolve, and these populations become absorbed into a sort of white mass where the ethnic identity is no longer the operating identity, it's the white identity. And this particularly is important as people move further west. Now, Asians that were coming to the United States found themselves in a very different situation, particularly the Chinese and Japanese, during the same period. There was, on one hand, they shared with the European immigrants, there was great hostility towards them. Excuse me, but the hostility did not end after one generation. And in fact, there were political movements that developed for the expulsion of various Asians. And the most famous is probably the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And then there was also something called the Gentleman's Agreement that was arrived at between the United States and Japan, whereby the Japanese government, for its own reasons, blocked further Japanese migration to the United States. So you had entire movements, including within the labor movement, that was hostile and remained hostile towards Asians. Now, along the southern border, what's interesting in terms of Mexicans is, and I didn't realize this until literally 30 minutes before this program, the Border Patrol was only formed in 1924. I had thought that it would form sometime in the 19th century. But what I did know is that the US-Mexican border had been actually very open. And it was very easy for people from Mexico, and the United States for that matter, to cross the border, go back and forth. And so for Mexicans, one of the things that happened was that many Mexicans would migrate to the United States for work and then go home. And as Rodeker and Esch point out, the many segments of capital like that. And because what they would say is the Mexicans were good, we need them for work, and they'll go home. They don't stay here. And so back and forth. Now that starts to change when the Mexican Revolution takes place. And the United States was very hostile towards the Mexican Revolution. And so that begins to change then. One of the impacts of European migration to the United States is that there were cities where the European migrants block the ability of African Americans to rise in the economy because they are given jobs that African Americans are not. In fact, in the city of Boston, the African American population stagnated for years because there was simply no jobs other than domestic service for Black workers. Okay, after World War I, and in the context of World War I, there was that debate that I was mentioning earlier about who was white and who was not. And one of the things that was affecting that debate was the fear of communism, what they called Bolsheviki at that time. And there were right-wing forces in the United States that identified any Jew and any East European with being potentially a communist. And so that helped to fuel the move towards that 1924 Immigration Act to block who was coming here. But as I mentioned before, to come here as a European, it was actually pretty easy up until 1924. And then when World War II happens, immigration laws start to change, in part because of World War II. Chinese can come and Europeans who were running around for 20 years in the United States undocumented can all of a sudden become documented. Rose, this is a long answer to your question, but you asked it. Okay, so then let's bring it a little bit further. In 1965, largely as a result of the Civil Rights Movement, there's a major change in immigration law that starts to break down the racial barriers for people to come here. And that's when we see new populations coming, particularly from what we now know as the Global South. And so you had like Ethiopians, Eritreans coming, Filipinos, et cetera, that are coming to the United States. Much easier for them to come. And people from South Asia, Sri Lanka, India, et cetera, that had not come in large numbers before. So you have that. And then you start to have, because of a variety of factors, you start to have migrations from areas where the United States had played a major role in either controlling countries directly or indirectly. So people start migrating to the United States. The United States controlled the Philippines formally until 1946, and then informally ever since. Filipinos start coming here. From Latin America, where the United States, through the Monroe Doctrine, asserted its dominance and often and regularly destroyed the economies of countries there, and people start migrating to the United States. So you have documented and undocumented migration, but you also have that coming from Europe, most especially from Ireland. And so you start to see in the 1970s and 80s a large migration of undocumented Irish to the United States, at the same time that you're seeing undocumented immigrants coming from Latin America. And what's interesting here, again, is how race plays itself out. that you did not have these massive ICE, it wasn't called ICE then, it was INS raids on the Irish. But you did against Dominicans, against Haitians, against others. There was a moment in time when there was an attempt to reform immigration law in the 1980s, and Irish were being told very explicitly, don't unite with the Dominicans, Haitians, and others. There will be a deal for you as Irish. And then more recently, in the post-Cold War era, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, we started to see the migration, legal and otherwise, of people from the former Soviet Union, particularly Russians and Ukrainians. And this is where it's interesting to talk about Donald Trump. And I'll end my point here. In 2015, when he announced that he was going to run, he warned against the danger of the Mexicans coming here bringing crime. You probably remember that. And so leaving aside that actually Donald didn't just mean Mexicans, he was talking about all Latinos and Latinas. But let's leave that aside for a second. What was fascinating was who he didn't mention. Okay, now, one history point. Every population that has migrated to the United States has either brought with it or has incubated a criminal organization once they're here. Cosa Nostra ring a bell? The Irish mob, the Jewish mob. Ever hear of Meyer Lansky, right? Right? So it's like, it's not limited to Mexicans, right? It's not limited to Salvadorans. It's not limited to the Japanese and the Yakuza. Everybody has either brought with them or created a criminal organization here. But the other thing that's fascinating is who Trump never mentioned and still never mentions. The most feared criminal organization in the United States is not MS-13, it's not the Yakuza, it's not the Cosa Nostra, it's the Russian mob. Never mention them once. And you gotta ask, well, like, why not? I mean, you know, I don't like Trump, but Trump's not a complete idiot. I mean, he knows about the Russian mob. Why isn't he not mentioning the Russian mob? Because you mention the Mexicans and it rings a racial bell, right? It's bing, 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 bing. You talk about the Russian mob, things get a little bit more complicated. Here's a related point. The whole thing about anchor babies, right? Remember anchor babies? Allegedly, women coming from Latin America and Asia to have their babies in the United States so that they could become citizens. Well, folks, I'm here to tell you, documented on 60 Minutes, so you know it's got to be true. There's an entire industry of Russian women to go to Florida to have babies. It's documented. But that never comes up. Never. Why not? Again, there's a racial bell that is rung when you talk about anchor babies. The immediate thought is not Russian women, it's Mexican women, Filipinas, right? Chinese, but not Ukrainians. And see, that's the way it works. So that's my long answer to your point, Rose, about immigration. It has always been racial, and it's one of the reasons that it's really important for us to recognize that when people talk about we have an immigration crisis in the United States, we don't. We have a crisis that's around immigration of people from the global South because there are no ICE raids against the Irish. There are no ICE raids against the Russians. I mean, they're not the targets. I mean, I used to work for a union that represented ICE. I've been around these guys. I never heard them once talk about Russians. They would talk about people with accents. They'd not be talking about Ukrainians. There's a question here from Nancy. A question to your last point. I think one could say that white wealthy men have had a strategic plan to retain power for hundreds of years. How do you suggest we, the others, join together to raise up when we're fighting with ourselves? Amen. So, you're absolutely right. That has been the plan. That was the plan for the Brits when they took over Ireland. That was the plan of the Spanish and the Portuguese when they invaded the Western Hemisphere. It was the plan of the British and the plan of the so-called founding fathers. That was the plan, to keep us at the bottom fighting one another. So what do we do about it? Well, we do a few things. One is we do exactly what you guys are doing right now. Have the discussion right out there in the open. We've got to talk with people and our members, particularly in the union movement, about history. It's not about whether we like each other. It's irrelevant whether we like each other. I mean, it'd be nice, but it's irrelevant fundamentally. It's about whether we understand that we're not each other's enemies. I'm not, when Trump, for example, is saying to white suburban women, watch out for these people that are going to move into your suburban areas. And it's just sort of like, I feel like I'm listening to some Roman emperor talking about what the Visigoths are going to do if they break into Rome or something. No, that's not what's going on. So one thing we got to do is we have to do much more education. And that's reading, it's discussion groups. I think it's really important for people to have an opportunity to have discussion groups about things. It's also about the leadership of our organizations pointing out the way that we're being played for suckers. So, in the healthcare industry, in addition to the way that, for example, I'm not even gonna say that. In the healthcare industry, as you know better than I, there's all kinds of racial segregation in terms of who is in what departments, who gets what jobs, who gets disciplined what way, favoritism that plays itself out. And one of the things that we can do is have a leadership that says, no, we're not going for that BS. We're going to take it on. If there's segregation, we're not going to permit it. And it doesn't matter whether it's a segregation that is carried out by a Filipina nurse that brings in other Filipinas, or whether it's someone from Belarus that brings in other people. We're not going to allow the managers of our institutions, hospitals or whatever, to play us off against one another. Anybody should have a right to whatever job if they have the qualifications. So we've got to have a leadership that basically says, we're not going to tolerate this, that we're not going to tolerate discriminatory hiring. So it's that kind of activism that becomes very important. The other thing that I think is really important is beyond what happens in the workplace, our members need to understand what's at stake in the larger society. I was frankly, I have to say, I was furious that the organized labor did not speak out stronger when Trump announced his bid for the presidency in 2015. And he made these outrageous statements about who was bringing crime here and rapes and all this other stuff. It's like our movement should have spoken out and said, no, we're not going to sit here and listen to that. We know what you're trying to do. So it's a combination of things that I think that we've got to do that actually bring about unity. And we've seen, see, this is not just Bill talking, it's not just like wishful thinking. We've seen in the past organizations that have taken strong stands against racism that have been able to grow and thrive. One of my favorite unions was the packing house workers, which is now part of the United Food and Commercial Workers. But they had a very strong stand against discrimination, including the hiring practices, internal, promotional practices, who got what jobs, everything. And they built an incredibly strong union. The industrial workers of the world was the only labor federation in US history that would not permit segregated components. And in fact, they did something that was very courageous. If an organization was segregated and they wanted to affiliate, they tell them no. They say, you go desegregate, then come on back. So there's things that we can do right now that can start building unity.
You know, Bill, another subject that I think would be interesting to have you talk on is a little bit, because we are in the House of Labor, and we are here in Minnesota, where George Floyd was murdered last May by a police officer.
Yes.
And we've had some conversation, and we've certainly taken a position in regards to the president of the union of the Minneapolis Police Department, who is very blatantly racist and doesn't hide it. And we have taken a position that he needs to step down, and so has the Minnesota AFL-CIO here, the state. And so maybe a little conversation, because on the flip side, as nurses, nurses work closely with law enforcement. You know, they work in ERs, and they're in many times there are nurses who are married to police officers. And so, you know, giving us some perspective on your thoughts around police unionism, and sort of even a little history on where the police started in this country, and how they have interacted with organized labor over the course of our history, might be kind of some helpful grounding for us as well.
Sure. And before I answer that, someone sent a note asking about recommended readings. So at the risk of being completely immodest, I'm going to recommend a booklet that I did for the Washington State Labor Council on race and labor. And I can't remember whether I had sent it to you guys, but I can do that. It is not copyrighted. You can share it freely. It's about 50 pages, and there's loads of footnotes, which goes to the question of other readings. Loads of footnotes. Now, one of the reasons we did that was not to show how smart I am, but basically because we wanted to make sure that, because people are always asking, what else can we read? Well, we want to give you an example. But the other reason was we want to make sure that when people look at this, they understand we know what we're talking about. We're not just like making this stuff up. We're documenting things. So that's one thing I'd recommend. There's a great book that is called The Many-Headed Hydra, Hydra, that's co-authored by a guy named Linebaugh and something else. And it's actually, you can get a free PDF online. You can also buy it. And I love it. It read like a novel. And it's about the formation of capitalism in the North Atlantic countries and what happened here. So it's about race, class, gender, piracy, who the pirates were. So I would recommend that. Now, to your question about the police. So police were formed when the British, when we were a British colony. One of the things about the British that many people are unaware of is that the British were vicious when it came to punishing people for crimes. They would hang somebody at the drop of a hat, both in Britain and here in North America. What we know of as police largely began as slave patrols, and then over time, they evolved to play a different role, but fundamentally about protecting the property of the wealthy, not fundamentally about preventing crime. They also interacted with militias, what we now call National Guard. And their role was to fight the Indians, Native Americans. Now, in the 19th century, police become more active in fighting labor unions. So you had formal police organizations and you had informal police organizations, private police that existed in the United States to go, the Pinkertons is an example, that were used to go after labor organizers. In 1919, there was a famous police strike in Boston, and it was crushed. And police have not struck since. Police have had a complicated relationship to the rest of organized labor, which is to say that for the most part, they express no solidarity with unions until they need the support of unions, such as if they're going for a raise or something along those lines. And they operate basically like a brotherhood. So organized labor has had a complicated history with police because police are often used to break strikes and to break up protests. So you'll see within the labor movement, even leaving aside issues of race, you'll see an ambivalence about police, whether they should even be part of our movement or not. So there's two parts to your point, Rose. One is about police unions and one is about police. And let me just say a little bit more about police. One of the differentials in treatment that has been experienced by those of us of color revolves around law enforcement. Who gets killed, who doesn't? Who gets jailed, who doesn't? Who gets charged for what crimes and who doesn't? You see, for example, the opioid crisis that we're going through now, that I'm sure you guys are very familiar with. Well, there's been an opioid crisis in this country since the 1960s. It was called heroin. But when it was a heroin crisis, it was treated as a racial crisis. It was a crisis of African Americans, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, and Chicanos. But when the opioid crisis spread into large white areas, then it became a social crisis. And it started to get treated differently by law enforcement. So this has led to a great deal of suspicion about law enforcement. It's like, what was the child's name? Tamir Rice, who was shot playing with guns. And I was thinking, when I was a kid growing up in the Bronx, I played with guns. And if, I think about, wow, if like somebody had called the cops because I was playing with a gun, it never occurred to me at the time that I could lose my life. And I would say for most white people, it never occurred to them either, that anyone could lose their life. But one of the other things that happens with law enforcement and this differential in treatment is that when we get killed or jailed, one of the things that frequently happens is immediately going to our character. It's like when a woman is raped and all of a sudden there's an attack on the woman's character. She somehow deserved it as a way of explaining away the rape. And a version of that happens racially when we get attacked, jailed, or killed. That all of a sudden, because I may have been arrested 20 years ago, that ends up being raised almost as a way to excuse away my being killed. So this has created grounds of a great deal of hostility. So one thing I think that is really incumbent, and I've been pushing within the labor movement, is that within the labor movement, we need to have a movement-wide discussion about law enforcement. And what should law enforcement be in the 20th century? And I don't mean just cops. I mean, also ICE. I mean, what do we think about putting kids in cages? You know, is that acceptable for a civilized society? You know, what do we think about breaking up, taking kids away from their parents? I mean, is that what a civilized society does? So I think that on the one hand, organized labor needs to have that discussion. And our union should do that with our members and just, you know, freely. A second thing is the slogans that have been arisen, like, defund the police or abolish police. I think that it's important for people to understand that slogans that spontaneously arise have about as many meanings as there are galaxies in the universe. I mean, they're just like all over the place. What I talk about is rethinking policing, restructuring policing, reallocating resources, and demilitarizing police. Now, the reality is that police aren't going to be abolished. So it's like, we shouldn't even focus on that discussion. It's not going to happen. Right? And the reality is also that most people want some police. My daughter, I tell people this, and it scares some people on the left when I say this, even though I'm quite left. My daughter was held up at gunpoint a few years ago, along with some friends of hers. Two guys had been following them, pull a gun on her. And I've said publicly, and I will continue to say, that if a cop had put a bullet in the head of that person who pulled a gun on my daughter, I would not have cried a tear. Not one tear. My attitude is, if you pull a gun on an unarmed civilian, not in self-defense, you get what you get. I don't care what happens to you. But what about circumstances like what happened in Rochester? You have a mentally ill person. Or in the case of George Floyd, where there was an allegation of a possible counterfeit money being passed. Is the automatic response to show up with a pistol? And that's what I'm talking about by rethinking. I think we have to rethink law enforcement and how we deal with law enforcement. You know, every time there's an incident like what happened with George Floyd, I think about my own experiences. Back in the 1980s, when I was an organizer for this union, District 65 in Boston, part of the UAW, United Auto Workers, one night after contract negotiations, I was on my way home. It was dark. I was in a black car, a Dodge Daytona kind of room. And I saw this car approaching with a Jeep. And the guy cut in front of me and stopped. And this white guy gets out of the Jeep, just, you know, dressed, he had like a jean jacket on, and he's approaching my car. Because I'm a political activist, I said, is this a hit? I threw the car in reverse and I was getting ready to gun it and get the hell out of there. And I happened to listen because I heard this noise. And then I listened, and all of a sudden I heard it. He said, I heard some say police. And I decided to take a chance, and I didn't go anywhere. And it was a cop, a plainclothes cop. And he looked at my car and then yelled at someone else, no, this isn't the car. And they took off. There were no lights. From far away, I could not see any kind of badge. I could not hear, my window was up. I thought my life was in danger. And I went home and I told my wife, I was shaking, I was shivering. I said, baby, you know, if I had done what I first was thinking, I might not have come home because they might have killed me. You know, that's part of the reality. And I think that this issue of the differential in treatment in law enforcement is something that many whites simply don't get because it's outside of their experiences. And that's why these kind of discussions are very important. All right, now Rose, to your question about police unions. I think every worker has a right to a union, including soldiers, by the way. There are about 9 countries on the planet that have unionized military. And so I believe in unionization across the board. But the fact of someone being in a union doesn't mean that they're really in a labor movement. Because to me, being in a labor movement is really summarized by something that A. Philip Randolph said years ago. The essence of trade unionism is social uplift. The labor movement is the home for the despised, the destitute, the poor, etc., the dispossessed. That to me is the criteria of being in a labor movement. If you, in my opinion, if that's not who you are, whether you're a police union or whether you're a building trades union, you don't need to be in our movement. And so I think it's really important that we have a criteria. I think that any worker that wants to form a union should form it. There are unions that I despise, but the workers of that particular industry have every right to form those unions. I'm not going to tell someone that they shouldn't. And I'm also not going to tell anyone because I really worry that that becomes a slippery slope. If we start saying that the police can't have a union, then the right wing is going to say, you know what, you're right. And neither should the teachers. And neither should the fire department. And then all of a sudden, nothing. According to my clock, we have about 5 minutes, and I want to respect your time.
Has anybody else got any questions or thoughts or comments for Bill?
I would just like to ask the differentiation between, quote, a brotherhood and a union, because there's got to be a difference. So what is the difference?
Okay, so the term brotherhood was basically a term from the 19th century when unions were male dominated, if not male entirely, most unions. There were always women in unions, but there was a period of time when they were like overwhelmingly male dominated. And in some ways, this was an outgrowth of the guilds and the secret societies and like the Masons, groups like that. And so over time, these organizations, even when women came in, didn't change their names. So they were always, they were unions, but they went by that name brotherhood. And the notion was, to put it in its best light, was supposed to suggest camaraderie, but it was a camaraderie of men. The Teamsters under Ron Carey attempted to change their name. And they eliminated brotherhood. And when Hoffa took over, he returned the name to brotherhood. So I would argue that certainly every union, if they have brotherhood in the name, should eliminate it. It's insulting.
Well, I just want to mention before we let you go, Bill, that it's just such a pleasure and such an honor to have you here with the nurses. For everybody on here who doesn't know, Bill has been an activist for a few decades or so. He has worked for a number of labor unions, including serving as a senior staff person at the National AFL-CIO. He's also a former president of the TransAfrica Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies. He's an editorial board member of blackcommentator.com, and he serves in a number of leadership positions for other projects. He talked about the book that he's going to provide for us to pass on to you, but he's also a co-author of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers in the Formation of the Congress of the Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 41. He's co-author of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, which I haven't read yet, Bill, but I'm planning to order because that sounds like a must read. And also author of They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. Bill continues to be a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator on television, radio, and of course on the web. So we were awful lucky and very, very pleased to have you here today, Bill. Thank you so much for spending time with us, brother, today with the nurses. This is good stuff, and we are looking forward to making some movements within our union around these issues of tackling and dismantling racism and working on that in the community at large as well. So thank you so much for being here. Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely, pleasure. And if I
You
can
bet.
be of further help, get back to me.
You know I will.
Okay.
Thank you
Take care
so
then.
much.
Sure.
All right.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.